They say home is where someone is waiting for you, but sometimes, home is where you discover who didn't wait at all. The bus hissed as it came to a stop, releasing a breath of cold autumn air into the quiet street of Millbrook, a town Ethan Cole had not seen in over a year, a town that once held every memory he had tried so hard to outrun. He stepped down onto the cracked pavement, his boots landing with a dull weight, the kind that came not just from miles traveled but from years carried in silence, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his eyes scanning a place that felt both familiar and strangely distant, like a photograph left too long in the sun. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down on the rooftops, and the wind moved through the narrow streets with a soft, restless whisper, tugging at loose signs and forgotten corners as if the town itself was trying to speak. Ethan paused near the old bus stop bench, the paint peeling, the wood worn smooth by time, and for a moment he simply stood there, breathing in the scent of damp leaves and asphalt, grounding himself in the reality of being back, of no longer waking to distant echoes and coded routines, of no longer needing to listen for danger in every quiet moment. He wasn't looking for anything dramatic, not anymore, just a place to sit, maybe a hot meal, maybe a chance to remember what it felt like to belong somewhere without needing to explain why. But then his eyes caught something across the street, something that didn't fit into the version of home he had carried with him through long nights and longer roads. At first it was just a shape near the curb, a figure hunched beneath a worn coat, sitting beside a small cardboard sign that fluttered weakly in the wind, the edges curled and soft from too many days outside, and next to her, lying still but alert, was a dog. Ethan's breath slowed, not in calm but in disbelief, his body going still in a way that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with recognition that arrived too quietly to be denied. The dog lifted its head first, ears rising slowly as if responding to something deeper than sound, amber eyes locking onto Ethan with a steady, unshaken focus that cut through the distance between them. Rex. The name didn't leave Ethan's lips, but it echoed through him all the same, carrying with it 1,000 small memories, the sound of paws on wooden floors, the quiet presence at his side before everything had fallen apart. The dog didn't bark, didn't move right away, just watched, as if confirming something it had known long before this moment arrived. Ethan felt his chest tighten, a pressure building that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the way the past can step into the present without warning. Slowly, almost unwillingly, his gaze shifted from the dog to the woman beside him, and the world seemed to narrow to a single, impossible point. Her hands were thinner than he remembered, her posture smaller, her hair now more silver than gray, caught loosely beneath a faded scarf that couldn't quite hold it back from the wind, and though her face was turned slightly away, there was no mistaking the quiet lines, the familiar curve of her shoulders, the presence that had once been the center of his world. Margaret. His mother. Ethan didn't move, not yet, because something about the moment felt fragile, like stepping too quickly might break it into something worse, something final. The street around them continued as if nothing had changed, a car passing slowly, a door closing somewhere down the block, the ordinary rhythm of a town that hadn't stopped for his return, but for Ethan, time had shifted, bending around a truth he wasn't ready to face. Rex stood then, not rushed, not frantic, just rising with a calm certainty, his tail low but steady, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face, and with each step the dog took toward him, the distance between what was and what should have been seen to dissolve. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath uneven, his hand tightening slightly around the strap of his bag as if anchoring himself to something real, something solid, because whatever he had expected to find when he came back, it wasn't this. And yet, as Rex stopped a few feet away, looking up at him with that same unwavering gaze, there was a quiet understanding in the silence. Between them, something unspoken but undeniable. Some things, no matter how far you go, will always find their way back to you. The distance between them closed in slow, measured steps, the kind that felt heavier than they should, as if each foot of pavement carried a memory Ethan had not yet decided to face, and Rex remained still until Ethan was close enough to see the faint silver threading through the dog's coat, the subtle signs of time that had passed without him, the quiet endurance of a companion who had stayed when everything else had shifted, and when Ethan finally stopped just a few feet away, Rex took one stepped forward and pressed his head gently against Ethan's hand, not with excitement, not with urgency, but with a calm recognition that needed no explanation, and Ethan's fingers curled instinctively into the familiar fur, grounding himself in something that had not changed, something that had not left. For a moment, he said nothing, because words felt too small, too late, and the only sound was the soft rustle of wind moving through the street, carrying with it the distant hum of a passing car and the faint creak of a sign swaying overhead, and then, slowly, he looked up again at the woman sitting on the curb. Margaret had not yet turned fully toward him, as if she already knew and needed a second longer to gather whatever strength remained, and when she finally did, her eyes met his with a quiet stillness that held no surprise, only a tired kind of knowing, the kind that comes from waiting longer than anyone should have to. "Ethan," she said softly, his name leaving her lips like something fragile, something that had been held too long in silence, and the sound of it seemed to settle into the space between them, filling the distance that time had created. Ethan swallowed, the motion slow and deliberate, his voice catching before it could fully form, and when he spoke, it was quieter than he expected, almost uncertain. "Mom, what happened?" The question lingered in the air, not demanding, not accusing, just searching, and Margaret lowered her gaze briefly, her hands tightening slightly around the edge of the worn coat draped over her lap as if it could hold together more than just fabric. "Life happened," she replied after a moment, her voice steady but worn, carrying the weight of days that had stretched too long and nights that had offered little rest, and though the words were simple, they seemed to carry more than she was willing to say right now. Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing around the street as if the answer might be written somewhere in the cracked pavement or the faded storefronts, but everything looked the same as it always had, unchanged and indifferent, and that made it harder to understand how things could have shifted so far without him noticing. Rex stepped back then, returning to Margaret's side, sitting close enough that his shoulder brushed against her leg, his posture alert but calm, watching Ethan with that same steady gaze, as if reminding him that whatever had happened, he was part of it now, whether he was ready or not. Ethan adjusted the strap on his shoulder, the bag suddenly feeling out of place, like it belonged to someone who had not yet arrived, and he glanced down at Margaret again, really seeing her now, the way her shoes were worn thin at the soles, the way her hands trembled just slightly when she shifted her weight, the way the cardboard sign at her feet had been carefully written but had begun to fade at the edges, and something inside him tightened, not sharp, not overwhelming, but steady and undeniable. "Come on," he said finally, his voice firmer now, not because he had all the answers, but because standing there was no longer an option. "Let us get out of the cold." Margaret hesitated for just a second, her eyes searching his face as if confirming something she had once believed and was not sure she could believe again, and then she nodded, slowly, carefully, and reached for Rex's collar as she began to stand. Ethan stepped forward without thinking, offering his arm, and though she tried to steady herself on her own, she accepted it, her grip light but present, and together they moved away from the curb, away from the place that had held them too long, walking toward whatever came next without knowing exactly what that would be. The wind followed them down the street, softer now, as if the town itself had exhaled, and somewhere behind them, the empty space they left felt quieter than before, as if something that had been waiting had finally begun to move again. The motel sat at the edge of town where the streetlights grew sparse and the sidewalks gave way to patches of gravel and quiet neglect, its flickering neon sign humming softly against the early evening sky, and Ethan pushed open the glass door with a steady hand, the warmth inside brushing against his face like something unfamiliar but needed, the faint scent of old carpet and brewed coffee settling into the air as Margaret stepped in slowly beside him, her movements careful as if she were crossing into a place she did not quite trust to hold her, and Rex followed close, his nails clicking lightly against the tiled floor, ears alert, eyes moving from corner to corner with the quiet vigilance that had never left him. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up, sliding a key across without questions, and Ethan accepted it with a nod, his focus already shifting toward the narrow hallway that led to their room, a place that was not home but at least was not the street. Inside, the room was small, just 2 beds, a dim lamp, and curtains that carried the color of too many seasons, but when Margaret sat down at the edge of the mattress, she let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than exhaustion, As if the simple act of being indoors had loosened something she had been holding together for too long. Ethan set his bag down near the door, his movements quiet, controlled, but his eyes never left her, studying the small details that spoke louder than anything she had said, the way her shoulders remained slightly hunched even in safety, the way her hands rested in her lap as if unsure what to do without something to hold on to, and Rex circled once before lying down at her feet, positioning himself so that he could watch both her and the door, a silent promise that he would not miss anything. That mattered. For a while, no one spoke, and the silence that filled the room was not empty but heavy with things that had not yet found their way into words. And it was Rex who broke it first, lifting his head suddenly, ears tilting toward the window, a low sound forming in his chest, not a growl but something closer to recognition, something that pulled his attention beyond the thin glass and into the fading light outside. Ethan noticed immediately, his posture tightening just slightly, his instincts rising not out of fear but out of habit, and he stepped closer to the window, parting the curtain just enough to look out. The parking lot was still, a few scattered cars, a street lamp casting a pale circle onto the asphalt, nothing that should have drawn that kind of focus, and yet Rex did not look away. "What is it, boy?" Ethan murmured, his voice low, more to himself than to the dog, but Rex stood then, moving to the door, pausing there as if expecting something, then glancing back toward Ethan with that same steady, knowing look that had followed him since the moment they met again. Margaret shifted slightly on the bed, watching the exchange with a quiet tension that had not been there before, her fingers tightening together. "He does that sometimes," she said softly, her voice carrying a trace of something Ethan could not quite place, not fear, not confusion, but something closer to certainty. "Especially at night, or when we are near the old house." The words settled into the room with a quiet weight, and Ethan turned slowly, his gaze meeting hers with a sharper focus now, the pieces of something larger beginning to move just beneath the surface. "What do you mean, near the old house?" he asked, his voice calm but deliberate, and Margaret hesitated, her eyes drifting briefly toward Rex before returning to Ethan, as if deciding how much to say and how much to leave where it had been buried. "It started a few weeks before everything fell apart," she said, her tone distant, as though she were walking back through memory one careful step at a time. He would stop in the hallway, stare at the floor, like he was listening to something underneath. Rex let out a soft, single breath at that, settling back onto his paws but not relaxing, his gaze fixed on Ethan as if urging him to understand something that could not be explained in simple words, and Ethan felt it then, not as a clear thought but as a shift, a quiet pull towards something unresolved, something waiting. Outside, the wind moved again, brushing against the window with a soft, steady rhythm, and for the first time since stepping back into town, Ethan realized that whatever had taken his mother from her home might not be finished with them yet. The room grew quieter as the evening settled in, the kind of quiet that did not feel empty but waiting, and Ethan remained standing near the window for a long moment, his hand still resting against the curtain as he watched the faint reflection of the street lamp ripple across the glass, his mind turning over Margaret's words with a careful, deliberate focus, the way he had learned to process things that did not yet make sense, and behind him Rex shifted again, rising slowly to his feet, his posture alert, his ears angled not toward the outside now but toward the floor itself, as if whatever had called his attention earlier had followed them here in a way that could not be seen. Ethan let the curtain fall back into place and turned, his gaze dropping to the worn carpet beneath his boots, tracing the uneven patterns as if searching for something hidden in plain sight, and he took a few slow steps across the room, each one measured, listening not with his ears but with something deeper, something instinctive that had kept him alive more times than he cared to count. "You said he listened to the floor," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady but carrying a sharper edge now, and Margaret nodded, her eyes following him as he moved, her expression caught somewhere between worry and relief, as though she had been waiting for someone else to see what she could not explain. "In the hallway mostly," she answered, her hands folding together again, "and near the old staircase, like something was moving beneath it, but there was never any sound I could hear." Rex stepped forward then, crossing the small space with quiet purpose, and stopped near the foot of the second bed, his nose lowering toward the carpet, his body still except for the subtle movement of his breathing, and then he tapped the floor once with his paw, a soft, deliberate motion that seemed less like curiosity and more like recognition. Ethan watched him closely, his eyes narrowing just slightly, and without a word he crouched down, pressing his palm flat against the carpet where Rex had touched, feeling for anything unusual, any vibration, any shift that might explain the dog's behavior. But there was nothing at first, only the steady firmness of the ground beneath him, and yet he did not pull his hand away. He waited. The room held its breath with him, the faint hum of the motel's heating system the only sound breaking the stillness, and then, just as he was about to stand, he felt it. Not a movement, not exactly, but a faint pulse, so subtle it might have been imagined, a gentle rhythm that seemed to come and go beneath the surface, like something far below was shifting in a pattern too steady to be random. Ethan's hand remained where it was, his fingers pressing slightly harder as he focused, counting without realizing he was doing it, the seconds stretching between each faint sensation, and when it came again, just as soft, just as precise, his breath slowed. Rex let out a low sound, not a warning, not fear, but something older, something that seemed to echo the same rhythm Ethan had just felt, and Margaret leaned forward slightly on the bed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You feel it too, do you not?" Ethan did not answer right away, because answers required certainty, and certainty was not something he had yet, but the look in his eyes had changed, shifting from confusion to something sharper, something more focused. He stood slowly, glancing toward the door, then back to the floor, as if mapping out a connection he could not yet fully see, and the pieces began to align in a way that made the room feel smaller than it had before. "This is not just the house," he said finally, his voice low, controlled. "If it followed us here, then whatever it is not tied to a place the way we thought." The words settled into the space between them, and Margaret's expression tightened slightly, not in fear but in recognition, as though part of her had already known that the problem had never been confined to walls or property lines. Rex stepped back toward Ethan then, positioning himself at his side, his body steady, his presence grounding, and for a moment the three of them stood in that quiet room, connected not just by circumstance but by something deeper, something unfolding just beyond their understanding. Outside, the wind shifted direction, brushing against the building with a softer, almost guiding touch, and Ethan glanced once more at the floor before reaching for his jacket, the decision forming not as a question but as a certainty. Whatever had begun beneath that old house was waiting for him to come back and finish it. The decision settled over Ethan with a quiet finality, the kind that did not need to be spoken twice, and he moved with a steady purpose as he reached for his jacket, the fabric rough against his fingers, familiar in a way that reminded him of colder nights and clearer missions, and Rex was already at the door before Ethan even touched the handle, his body angled forward, waiting, not impatient but certain, as if this path had already been chosen long before Ethan understood it. Margaret rose slowly from the bed, her movements careful, her eyes searching Ethan's face with a mixture of concern and something softer, something that looked almost like hope trying to find its way back. "You are going there, are you not?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady, and Ethan paused for just a second, his hand resting on the doorknob, the cool metal grounding him in the moment. "I need to see it," he replied, not looking back yet, because the answer was not something he could soften or reshape, it simply was what it was, and after a brief silence, Margaret nodded, accepting it in the way only someone who had endured enough could accept anything, without resistance, without question. "Then I am coming with you," she said, and this time Ethan did turn, his expression shifting slightly, not into refusal but into consideration, weighing the quiet strength in her voice against the fragility he had seen just hours before, and before he could answer, Rex glanced between them, then stepped back toward Margaret, pressing lightly against her leg, as if making the choice for both of them. Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath that carried both hesitation and understanding, and gave a small nod. "We stay together," he said, the words simple but firm, and Margaret's shoulders eased just slightly at that, as though something inside her had been waiting to hear it. Outside, the air had cooled further, the kind of early evening chill that settled into the bones, and the sky had darkened into a muted blue-gray, the streetlights casting long, quiet shadows across the pavement as they stepped out of the motel and into the open, the wind brushing past them with a steady rhythm that felt less like resistance and more like guidance. The town stretched ahead in familiar lines, but now every corner seemed to hold a question, every building a piece of something Ethan had not yet put together, and Rex moved slightly ahead of them, not pulling, not rushing, but leading with a calm certainty that made Ethan follow without hesitation. They passed closed storefronts and dim windows, the town settling into its evening stillness, and with each step the distance to the old house seemed to shrink faster than it should, as if the path itself was shortening beneath their feet. Margaret walked close beside Ethan, her steps measured but steady, her gaze fixed forward, and though she said nothing, there was a quiet resolve in the way she carried herself now, a shift from survival to something closer to reclaiming. When they turned onto the familiar street, Ethan felt it immediately, the same subtle tension that had brushed against him in the motel room, a faint pressure in the air that did not belong to the cool breeze or the quiet night, and Rex slowed, his ears lifting, his body stilling for a moment before continuing, more focused now, more deliberate. The house came into view at the end of the block, its outline dark against the fading light, the structure unchanged and yet somehow distant, like a memory that had been waiting just out of reach, and Ethan stopped a few yards away, taking it in, the front porch, the windows, the door that had once opened without question, and now stood closed, silent. Rex stepped forward. Again, stopping at the edge of the walkway, his gaze fixed not on the door but on the ground just beyond it, his posture alert, his breathing steady, and then he let out a single, low sound, not loud, not urgent, but certain. Ethan followed his line of sight, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked toward the base of the steps, and though the ground appeared still, there was something about it that did not sit right, something subtle but present, like the faintest ripple beneath a surface that should have been calm. Margaret's hand found Ethan's sleeve, her grip light but steady, and he did not pull away. "It started here," she whispered, and Ethan nodded once, his focus sharpening, his breath steadying as the pieces of everything he had seen and felt began to align into something he could no longer ignore. Some places do not forget what was hidden beneath them, and some truths wait patiently for the moment someone is finally ready to uncover them. The air around the house felt different the closer they stepped, not colder in temperature but heavier in presence, as if the ground itself carried something that had been waiting too long to be acknowledged, and Ethan moved forward slowly, his boots pressing against the worn pathway leading up to the porch, each step deliberate, each breath measured, while Rex stayed just ahead of him, his body aligned with something unseen, something beneath the surface that guided him with a certainty no human sense could explain. Margaret followed closely, her hand still lightly resting against Ethan's sleeve, not holding him back but anchoring herself to the only thing that felt steady, and when they reached the base of the steps, Rex stopped completely, his ears rising, his head lowering just slightly as his eyes fixed on a single spot near the edge of the wooden porch where the concrete met the first board. Ethan noticed immediately, his gaze sharpening, and he stepped beside the dog, crouching slowly as he studied the ground, the faint cracks in the concrete, the subtle unevenness where years of weather had left their quiet marks, and yet something about it felt too deliberate to be natural, too precise in a way that did not belong to time alone. Rex let out a soft breath and tapped the ground once, then again, each motion controlled, intentional, and Ethan reached forward, brushing his fingers across the surface, feeling not just the texture but the slight difference beneath it, a hollow that should not have been there, a space that did not match the solid foundation he remembered. "There is something under this," Ethan said quietly, his voice low but certain, and Margaret's breath caught just slightly behind him, her eyes widening not in fear but in recognition, as if a piece of a long unanswered question had finally found its place. The wind shifted again, moving across the porch with a soft whisper that seemed to circle them rather than pass through, and Ethan stood, stepping back just enough to look at the structure as a whole, his eyes tracing the edges, the lines, the way the house settled into the ground, and for the first time, he saw it differently, not as a home, but as something built around something else. Rex moved to the side then, padding along the edge of the porch, his nose close to the boards, his steps slow, deliberate, until he stopped again near the far corner, turning back toward Ethan with that same steady gaze, and this time, Ethan followed without hesitation. He knelt again, pressing his hand to the wood, and there it was, clearer now, a faint vibration, steady and rhythmic, the same pulse he had felt in the motel, but stronger here, more defined, like the source was directly beneath them, waiting. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, counting the seconds between each subtle tremor, the pattern aligning in his mind with a precision he trusted, and when he opened them again, there was no doubt left, only focus. "It is the same rhythm," he said, more to himself than anyone else, and Margaret stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "That is when everything changed," she said, her gaze fixed on the spot, the night it started. Rex would not leave this place. Rex lowered himself slowly onto the porch, his body still, his ears alert, as if guarding something unseen, and Ethan reached for the edge of one of the boards, his fingers testing its give, feeling. The slight movement that confirmed what he already knew, that this was not just structure, not just foundation, but an entrance disguised as something ordinary. He did not pull it yet, not fully, because something about the moment required patience, required understanding before action, and he looked back at Margaret, meeting her eyes with a calm steadiness that held both reassurance and truth. "Whatever is down there," he said quietly, "it has been here a long time." The words settled between them as the last light of day faded into a deeper shade of blue, and the house stood silent above them, not empty, not forgotten, but holding its breath, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment, for the right hands to finally listen to what it had been trying to say all along. The porch creaked softly beneath Ethan's weight as he shifted closer to the loose board, the sound carrying into the quiet evening like a memory being disturbed after too many years of silence, and Rex remained still beside him, his body low but alert, his eyes fixed on Ethan's hands as if he understood that whatever came next mattered more than anything that had happened before. Ethan ran his fingers along the edge again, slower this time, feeling the slight gap where wood met wood, the subtle difference that separated this board from the rest, and without rushing, he adjusted his grip and began to lift. At first it resisted, not firmly but enough to remind him that it had not been moved in a long time, and then, with a quiet shift, it gave way, rising just enough to reveal a narrow seam beneath, a thin line of darkness where no light had touched for years. The air changed immediately, a faint breath rising from below, cool and still, carrying with it the scent of earth and something older, something that did not belong to the surface world above. Margaret stepped closer without realizing it, her hand tightening gently against Ethan's sleeve, her eyes drawn to the opening as if something inside her recognized it long before her mind could catch up, and Rex leaned forward slightly, his nose lowering toward the gap, his ears angled forward with intense focus, but he did not bark, did not react. With fear, only watched, as if confirming something that had already been decided. Ethan lifted the board further, revealing a hidden hatch beneath it, a solid piece set into the ground, its edges worn but deliberate, not accidental, not natural, and he paused for a moment, his hand resting on the surface, his mind moving through possibilities, through questions that did not yet have answers, and then he looked back at Margaret. "Did you ever open this?" he asked quietly, and she shook her head slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "I did not even know it was there." The truth of that settled into the space between them, deep and undeniable, and Ethan nodded once, turning his attention back to the hatch as he found the small metal ring embedded into its center, cold beneath his fingers, and with a steady pull, he lifted. The hinges gave a soft, drawn-out creak as the hatch opened, revealing a narrow set of wooden steps leading downward into darkness, the kind of darkness that did not simply hide what was below but held it, contained it, as if it had been waiting to be seen. Ethan did not move immediately, his eyes adjusting, his breathing steady, and then Rex stepped forward without hesitation, placing one paw on the top step before looking back at Ethan, his gaze calm, unwavering, and that was all the confirmation Ethan needed. "Stay close," he said quietly, more to Margaret than to the dog, and she nodded, her fear present but held in check by something stronger, something that had been building since the moment they left the street. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness below, revealing worn steps, a narrow passage, and walls lined with aged wood and stone, and without another word, he began to descend, each step careful, deliberate, the sound of his boots echoing softly in the confined space. Rex followed just ahead, his movements silent, precise, while Margaret came behind, her hand brushing the wall lightly for balance, her breath steady despite the unknown that waited below. The deeper they moved, the stronger the faint rhythm became, not loud, not overwhelming, but constant, a subtle pulse that seemed to come from somewhere ahead, somewhere just beyond the reach of the light, and Ethan felt it not just through his feet but through his chest, a quiet alignment with something that should not have been there and yet was. The passage opened slightly at the bottom, the space widening into a small chamber, and as the light spread across it, shapes began to form, outlines of objects long untouched, surfaces covered in dust but preserved in a way that felt intentional. And Ethan stepped forward slowly, his eyes scanning, taking in every detail, every sign, until his gaze settled on something at the center of the room that made him stop completely. It was not the size or the shape that caught him, but the presence, the way it seemed to belong exactly where it was, as if everything around it had been built to protect it, to hide it, to wait for the moment someone like him would finally stand there and see it. Some secrets do not call out loudly, they wait quietly, knowing the right person will hear them when the time comes. The beam of Ethan's flashlight steadied as his eyes adjusted to the quiet weight of the chamber, the dust in the air drifting slowly through the narrow cone of light like time itself had been suspended here, untouched and waiting. And at the center of the room stood a structure that did not belong to neglect or decay, but to purpose, a solid wooden chest reinforced with darkened metal bands, its surface worn but carefully preserved, as if every year that passed above ground had only deepened its silence rather than erased its presence. Rex moved forward first, his steps soft against the packed earth, his nose lifting slightly as he circled the chest once, then stopped directly in front of it, sitting down with a calm certainty, his eyes fixed on Ethan as if to say this was what they had come for all along. Margaret remained near the bottom of the steps, her breath slow but uneven, her gaze moving from the chest to Ethan and back again, as though she were watching a memory she had never lived begin to unfold in front of her. Ethan stepped closer, the faint rhythmic pulse stronger now, no longer just beneath his feet but echoing subtly through the space itself, not loud, not threatening, but steady, like something alive in its own quiet way, and he reached out, his hand hovering for just a moment above the lid before finally resting against the wood. It was cool to the touch, smoother than it should have been after so many years, and for a brief second, the room seemed to settle around that contact, the air holding still as if acknowledging the moment. He did not rush, did not force anything open, instead he let his hand remain there, feeling, listening, the way he had learned to read what could not be spoken, and then slowly, with deliberate care, he lifted the lid. The hinges moved without resistance, opening in a quiet arc that revealed the contents within, and Ethan leaned forward slightly, the light following his gaze as it fell across neatly arranged objects that had not been disturbed, not even by time. Inside were documents, carefully wrapped in aged cloth, small metal containers sealed tight, and beneath them all, a leather-bound journal, its cover worn but intact, its presence commanding more attention than anything else in the chest. Rex let out a soft breath, shifting slightly but not breaking his focus, while Margaret stepped closer now, her hesitation giving way to something stronger, something that felt like recognition rising from a place she could not explain. Ethan reached down and lifted the journal first, its weight balanced in his hands, its surface marked by faint lines that spoke of years of use, and when he opened it, the pages inside were filled with careful handwriting, steady and precise, the kind that came from someone who understood the importance of being clear, of being remembered. He scanned the first lines, his eyes moving slowly, absorbing each word as if they carried more than just information, and then he paused, his breath catching just slightly as something in the writing aligned with what he had felt, what Rex had sensed, what Margaret had endured. This was not hidden to be lost, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, his voice carrying a quiet certainty that had not been there before, it was hidden to be found at the right time. Margaret stepped closer, her eyes searching the pages, though she could not yet see clearly what Ethan saw, but she felt it, the shift, the answer beginning to take shape, and Rex lowered himself gently beside them, his presence calm, grounded, as if his part in leading them here was complete, and now it was Ethan's turn to understand. The faint pulse in the room softened, not disappearing, but settling into something quieter, something less like a signal and more like a confirmation, and Ethan turned another page, his expression steady, focused, as the truth beneath the house, beneath the years, began to reveal itself piece by piece. Some legacies are not measured in what they give, but in when they choose to be seen. The pages turned slowly beneath Ethan's fingers, each line written with a clarity that felt intentional, as though the person who had written them knew exactly who would one day read them, and the deeper he went, the more the scattered pieces of the past began to settle into place, not as fragments, but as a story that had been waiting patiently beneath the surface of everything they had lost. The journal spoke of the house, not just as a home, but as a safeguard, a place chosen long ago to protect something that could not be trusted in plain sight, something tied not to wealth in the ordinary sense, but to a quiet legacy built over years of service, sacrifice, and decisions made when no one was watching. Ethan's eyes moved steadily across the final pages, his expression calm but deeply focused, and when he reached the last entry, he paused, reading it again, letting the words settle fully before he looked up. "It was never meant to be sold," he said quietly, his voice carrying a steady certainty that filled the chamber. "This house, everything here, it was left to protect something until the right person came back." Margaret stood beside him now, her gaze moving between the journal and Ethan's face, her eyes searching for understanding, and slowly, as if the meaning had been waiting just beyond her reach, something within her shifted. "Your father," she whispered, the realization forming not from surprise, but from recognition, "he always said." There were things he could not explain, things that had to stay hidden. Ethan nodded once, closing the journal gently, holding it for a moment longer as if acknowledging the weight of what had been entrusted, and Rex let out a soft breath beside them, his body finally relaxing in a way it had not since they arrived, as though his role in guiding them here had come to its natural end. The faint pulse that had filled the space began to fade, not disappearing entirely, but softening into something quieter, something that no longer demanded attention because it had already served its purpose. Ethan stood slowly, offering a hand to Margaret, and together they moved back toward the stairs, leaving the chamber not with urgency, but with a quiet sense of completion, as if the truth they had uncovered no longer needed to remain hidden beneath the ground. When they stepped back onto the porch, the night air greeted them with a gentle stillness, the wind calmer now, the sky opening slightly to reveal a few scattered stars breaking through the clouds, and for the first time since his return, Ethan felt something shift inside him, not a sudden change, but a steady easing, like a weight he had carried without noticing had finally been set down. Margaret stood beside him, her posture no longer as fragile, her gaze lifting toward the house with a softness that had not been there before, and Rex moved to sit at the edge of the porch, watching the quiet street with a calm, steady presence, no longer searching, no longer listening for something unseen. The house behind them remained silent, but it no longer felt distant or uncertain, it felt anchored, as though it had simply been waiting for them to return and understand what it had been holding all along. Ethan looked at his mother, then at the familiar lines of the home that had once been lost to them, and without needing to say it, they both understood that this was not just about reclaiming a place, it was about reclaiming something deeper, something that had never truly left, only been hidden beneath time and circumstance. He stepped forward, opening the front door slowly, the hinges moving with a soft sound that carried more welcome than resistance, and as they crossed the threshold together, the space inside felt different, not new, but restored, as if the past and present had finally found a way to stand side by side without conflict. Rex followed them in, settling near the doorway with a quiet ease, his watchful eyes now at peace, and Ethan paused for just a moment, taking in the stillness, the sense of something completed, something returned. Not all inheritances come with noise or celebration, some arrive quietly, waiting for the moment when a person is ready to understand what they were meant to carry, and in that quiet house, beneath a sky that had finally begun to clear, Ethan realized that what had been waiting for him was never just beneath the floor, it had been waiting within him all along.